in this session. Oh, and also Chanel, if you could record, that would be great.
Yeah, I just started.
Thanks. We're not going to tell you what to do. We're going to share information and make space to talk about what you want to do and to talk about what your best practice is going to be. So that's important. And then also leading well, let me get through some things. Okay. Welcome. That's it. Also, okay, here's what we like. If you can show your face, great. I know not everyone can for various reasons. That's fine. But yes, we need to see your name and organization on your little window. The reason is it helps us to take attendance, and attendance is crucial for funding, right? We need to tell people we're doing things and we're talking to real actual people. So please, please, please. So these are today's objectives. Again, we're going to learn about the protections that exist for mixed status families in relation to the FAFSA. We're going to review who is eligible to complete the FAFSA. And also we're going to develop our own best practices, our ways to talk, the resources we need with mixed status families about the FAFSA. This is the agenda. Look at this. Like, there's so many people here. Their names are not even on here, but really important. We've got folks here from President's Alliance. We got a lawyer from National Immigration Law Center. I'll let them introduce themselves in their time. But helping us sort of facilitate the day are two of my buddies. Kim Nauer, who's going to introduce herself, and then Chano going to introduce himself, and then we'll do our little icebreaker. Kim and Chano, if you could introduce yourselves.
Hey, I'll jump in. It's Chano. I'm the College Bound Director at Chestnut Schools, student advocate, FAFSA nerd, and glad to be here with everybody.
Hi, folks. I'm Kim Nauer. I am the publisher of a website called understandingfasfa.org and the author of a guide that you might have used in New York City Public Schools called Understanding FAFSA and Financial Aid. And I seek to help counselors figure out all the intricacies of the FAFSA. And one big intricacy that we're really grappling with in the coming year is how to help mixed status families through the FAFSA. So here to help in any way I can.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, guys. All right, so here's the way we're going to start. We're going to do an icebreaker. Here's the question I want you to think about, and then I want you to drop the answer in the chat, and then Chano and Kim, if they can help me monitor that and call out some of the answers, trends you see, whatever. What is one way that your family supported you on your educational journey?
So if we could get just a few answers, I'm trying to think about that help that myself.
Rick saying financially. Nella, normalizing success. I'm curious about that, Nella. If you're able to unmute yourself and feel comfortable, like, tell me what normalizing success means in relation to your support, or tell us in the chat, whatever feels more comfortable.
So we got lots of financially and emotionally. Sounds like lots here coming in.
Right. Love it. Just straight up language translation.
Vicky, you got your hand up. What you got to say?
So much. I mean, giving me their FAFSA, trusting me because they didn't know English, dropping off like toilet paper and paper towels for the dorm, making turkey for Thanksgiving for all of us so we could eat, because all my friends were also Latinos, but they were all from like out of town, so they couldn't go back home. So like feeding them too. Giving me rides home or rides back with stuff. Just all these little things along the way. And then just like being really excited when I graduated.
Yeah. I like that. I like that a
Yeah, that's a
lot.
high bar.
Yeah, I love that. And then Nella couldn't unmute, but she was saying to her, normalizing success means that her family didn't allow them to believe that Black excellence was an anomaly. I love that too. All of this is resonating with me. I don't know about you guys, Chano, Kim. Some folks said in the chat that they didn't get any support from their families, and that's a thing too, right? So I want to acknowledge you for saying that, and also acknowledge that families look all sorts of ways. Sometimes we choose our families and make up our group that supports us. So that's something I think about when you say that. I don't know what you guys are thinking, Chano, Kim.
100%. I'm recognizing all the things that are like so finite and technical, from FAFSA to, helping with documentation, to very like emotional support, just that belief in everybody. And sometimes people had to do it for themselves. Like you said, Sandy, that really resonated with me. Because this is all about, the involvement of families, right? We want people to be involved.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I love it. That's right. That's right. And that's what today's about too. It's about families, because our students that we're talking about are eligible. Our students are all eligible for the FAFSA, and now we need the family's help. But there might be some fear there, and there might be some stuff that's coming up for them that may not allow them to help in the way that they want to help. So we'll be talking about that today. All right. All right. I'm gonna turn it to Kim for context, and you tell me when you want me to advance slides.
Okay, thanks, Sandy.
Yeah.
I just have a few, like 2 or 3 slides, just to give folks a little bit of context to start this conversation. The first statement I'm going to make, which we all know, but it's really the core here, is that U.S. citizens in mixed status families are entitled to federal college aid. Like, we have to just start with this, that we have a whole group of students out there that should be getting their college aid and deserve their college aid. How many students are, and yet we're looking at a moment in mixed status families where many students and their families might be nervous or frightened about trying to apply for college aid. So how many students are we talking about who may be impacted? We're looking at about 22 million U.S. residents are members of a mixed status family. So that's a lot of people. About 1/4 of those are students who are currently in the K-12 system, potentially planning on going to college over the years. As far as like students right now, potential college students right now, or upcoming college students, we have estimates that there are some 500,000 students at ages 17 to 21 who are eligible to fill out the FAFSA, who are in mixed status families. And then if you think about the total universe of undergraduate students in the FAFSA world, that number is actually higher, because that would go to 24. So this number is much larger if you include the dependent students under the age of 24. So maybe we could think about this as like 1 million students who might be impacted by some of these scary headlines that they're all reading right now. You want to advance the slide, Sandy? So this is not anyone's imagination that there is reason to possibly fear the next Trump administration. This was on Meet the Press. So this wasn't just him speaking to his base. A couple Sundays ago, You know, we all know that President-elect made immigration the centerpiece of the Trump campaign, and then asked about families with mixed immigration status, where some are in the U.S. legally and some are illegal. Some of the are in the U.S. illegally. Trump said, "I don't want to be breaking up families." So the only way you don't break up a family is you keep them together, and then you send them all back. That was what he told an NBC reporter on one of the most prestigious Sunday morning talk shows. So it's his talking points are still as aggressive as they always have been, even though he's trying to strike tones of threads of unity in some of the things he's saying. So there is reason to fear. Next slide, please. Sandy. So we've been seeing a lot of debate within the counseling field about where to go, and I know that's why many of you folks are tuned in here today. So the National College Attainment Network, right around, I think it was the day the FAFSA opened, or right around that day, came out with a statement that was controversial, but they had thought it through. And they said they struck a tone where families should take pause before thinking about filling out the FAFSA. And they basically said, although the Higher Education Act prohibits the use of data, other than determining, for any use except to get you financial aid, NCAN cannot assure mixed status students and families that the data submitted to the U.S. Department of Education as part of the FAFSA process will continue to be protected. So there's uncertainty under the Trump administration simply because of the rhetoric he's put out there, right? We believe that mixed status families should make a considered decision about whether to submit identifying information to the federal government in an FSA-ID or FAFSA. And we'll get into this a little bit in the presentation, this guidance may be particularly relevant to mixed status families who are participating in the federal aid application process for the first time. So with the idea that there's a lot of families that are already in the FAFSA system, so they might be thinking about things a little differently. Next slide. But then this I do feel like is maybe more of the opinion of our world. And it's certainly when we all met together at CAAN as a group in the most recent CAAN meeting, we sort of came a little bit to this conclusion. The National Association for College Admission Counseling, like the big most important college admission counseling group in America. One of their policy folks was quoted last week. Concerns over filing the FAFSA are not new to students and families with questionable immigration status. And that's something we have to keep remembering ourselves, that these families sort of struggle with this day in and day out. Says NACAC's David Hawkins. We cannot guarantee that the future administration might or might not use this information, but we don't want to stoke fears when there isn't anything yet on the table that would suggest that this information would be used for anything other than financial aid. So as a very good friend of mine said, and I mentioned this in our CAAN meeting, do we want to make this hot when we don't need to make it hot? Do we want to sort of keep the temperatures cool and allow families to simply come to us with questions and then answer those questions? Next slide. So I interviewed Carla Fuchs, a good friend of mine, who's many of us know in the CAAN world. And I just wanted her to offer a little bit of pieces of advice to sort of frame our thinking for today. And she came up with some of this, so I pulled out of our conversation. Our role is to provide the student and family with the information that they need from an impartial perspective so they can make the right decision. So the idea here is always to be trying to hold yourself back and only be thinking about it from their perspective. Make no assumptions, and this is something I often forget myself. Undocumented students or family members must volunteer this information on their own. When a student or family member seeks advice, she offered ask about their concerns and fears first. Try to work and alleviate those first. Let the students and families know there are very strong laws protecting student information and FAFSA data, but these are uncertain times. And then this was a part that I loved the best. Is this a risk that you and your family are willing to take? And after you've had the conversations, if the answer is yes, let's make a plan. If the answer is no, let's make a plan. There are excellent plans to be made on both sides. So the key is that the family is feeling comfortable with the decision, and either way, the student can get to college. So just always work within the family's comfort zone. So that's a little bit of just a little framing to help us think about what we're going to be learning today. And next onto the stars of the show.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to turn it over to Corinne and Ignacia, and I'll let you guys introduce yourselves when you feel comfortable and when you
Oh, and do we want to talk about how to post questions to the chat and sort of how we want to work that?
Yes, so we're gonna have folks post their questions into the chat, and then periodically Ignacia and Corinne will take breaks where we'll bring the questions to their attention. Did I miss anything, Kim?
Please feel free to keep posting questions as they occur to you, and then we'll get them in the breaks. And so we want to make sure that every question is answered in the session.
Good. Turning it over.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandy and Kim. And thank you for welcoming me into this space today. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk with all of you and to learn with you about some best practices for supporting mixed status families through the FAFSA process and in considering their post-secondary options more generally. So my name is Corinne Kentor. I am the Policy and Communications Associate at the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration, a very long title. But for those of you who are not familiar with our organization, we focus on policy issues that impact all sorts of immigrant origin students, faculty, and staff in higher ed. So this includes undocumented students, those with DACA, those without DACA, international students and scholars, refugee students and displaced students, and students who have citizenship and are from mixed status families. And we work at the federal, state, and campus level across all different areas of the United States. So we have over 570 members representing those institutions in different kinds of districts. So I know today we'll be focused on the New York context, but we do work across the country, so we have a good sense of the different opportunities. I lead our FAFSA work coming out of my expertise on post-secondary education pathways for mixed status families. And I'll let Ignacia introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Ignacia Rodriguez Kmec with the National Immigration Law Center, NILC. I'm an attorney in the policy department here. My areas of expertise tend to be areas that intersect with immigration and education, such as better FAFSA and mixed status families, which we're going to talk about today, and Plyler v. Doe. And then also forms of affirmative immigration relief, such as DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Back to you, Corinne.
Thanks so much, Ignacia. And Sandy, if we could go to the next slide. So I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the partners that we work with. They are, this presentation is not from them. I don't want to make it seem like they are specifically endorsing the information that we are sharing today, but I did want to give you all a sense of the number of different organizations that are out there to support you in your work with students. These are just some of the many organizations that Ignacia and I partner with on our work on mixed status families. And so you can see that there are a lot of options for you as you're looking for resources. And all of these groups put together wonderful tools and trainings. So as you're looking for more support, I highly encourage you to check out all of their different websites in addition to the resources that we have developed to share with you today. Next slide. Great. So what are we going to talk about today? I want to be really clear about what we will and will not be able to accomplish in the time that we have. So what we are going to focus on is an overview of FAFSA data security, including a discussion of what information is collected as part of the FAFSA, how that information is stored, and who has access to that information. Ignacia will also cover some of the legal protections for FAFSA information, and then we'll talk about options available to families and give you some starting points for your conversations as you're working with individual cases. What we are not going to do today is provide any legal advice. For specific legal questions, you should consult an attorney. We're also not going to be able to talk to you about individual cases. I know that we may get some questions in the chat with a lot of specifics. Just due to the time constraints today, we won't be able to cover those, but you're definitely encouraged to reach out to me separately, and I'll put my email in the chat so that we can try to work through individual case snags together. And then finally, and this is reflecting what Kim shared at the beginning, these are not universal recommendations for all families to follow. We really encourage all of these conversations to be family-led and for you to remember when you're working with a student that they may have a lot of specific circumstances to consider. So our goal really is to give you as much information as possible so that you can go into those conversations confidently, but still with the recollection that each family is going to need individual support based on their circumstances. Next slide. Great. So again, echoing what Kim started with, because it is really, really important. And if you come away from this session with anything, I want it to be these 3 points. Students from mixed status families remain eligible for and entitled to federal and state financial aid. And just to clarify, when we're talking about what students from mixed status families, what we mean families where there are different immigration statuses. So this may be a family where the student is a citizen and the parents are not citizens. It might be a family where the student is an eligible non-citizen who is entitled to FAFSA. It might be a family where a parent is a DACA recipient. This is something that people forget all the time, but DACA recipients have children. Those children are going to college. So this is, when we say mixed status, we're talking just about different statuses within the same family. It doesn't all look the same. Secondly, parent citizenship status does not affect eligibility for aid. Eligibility for aid is dependent on the student status, whether that student is a citizen or an eligible non-citizen. And you can find a list of eligible non-citizens on the FSA website and also across all of our resources. And then finally, just reiterating that point, any citizen or eligible non-citizen can submit the FAFSA. So those are our 3 big messages that I also want to be sure frame your conversations. Next slide, please. Okay, so now getting into the weeds, and I think it was Chano who referred to himself as a FAFSA nerd. I am certainly self-identifying in that camp as well. I can get really detailed on this topic. I'm going to try to keep it somewhat high level, and then my colleagues and friends here will keep track of the questions in the chat so that we can get more granular in a way that makes sense for all of you. What is the information we're talking about that FAFSA is collecting? You'll hear a lot of reference to PII, which stands for personally identifiable information. You'll see this across the kind of government language about data protections and information protection. They'll often use PII to stand in for the things that can be used to identify an individual or that is specific to an individual. So some of the personally identifiable information that the FAFSA collects on the student side, you can see it's highlighted here, and this is taken directly from the FSA website, is the student's name, their social security number, their date of birth, their contact information, things like that. Now, the FAFSA also collects information from contributors. Contributors are the parent if the student is a dependent, or a spouse if the student is married, among others. So parent is pretty narrowly defined on the FAFSA. As we said earlier, families look all different ways, but for the purposes of the FAFSA, unless a student is in a legal guardianship or has been officially emancipated, the contributor refers to their parent. In some cases, the student may not live with the parent, but again, if they're not in a specific other kind of guardianship, that biological parent is, or adoptive parent is still the one considered the parent. The personally identifiable information collected from the parent includes things like their name, their date of birth, a mailing address, things like that. It does not include a social security number if the parent does not have one. If the parent does have a social, they should put that in on the FAFSA. If they don't, there will be opportunities for them to indicate that they do not have a social security number. So there's not a specific question on the FAFSA asking a parent to identify their immigration status. The closest that we get is that SSN field, which a parent without one would either leave blank, or in the case of the online form, they would check off a box saying, I do not have a social security number. But it is a small distinction, but one that I want to make sure to elevate, that there is no question saying what is your immigration status for the contributor. There is a question about whether or not you have a social. Next slide, please. So as we're thinking about the security of FAFSA information, and I think I've seen some of these questions in the chat, we're asking about, whose information might be at risk if this information were to be misused for a purpose other than for allocating aid. So we're thinking primarily about first-time FAFSA filers who are also the first in their family to file a FAFSA. If you have a student who has applied for FAFSA in the past, filing again this year would not put their information at any additional risk. It's the same information, their finances might change, but effectively it's the same personally identifiable information that they would be resubmitting this year. Additionally, if a student, say, has an older sibling who's filed a FAFSA, if we're thinking about the family information as the piece that we're concerned about in this conversation, that's not going to be any different this time. Then there's this third point, which is that family information is absent from all government databases. So I know there's some questions in the chat about ITINs. If you think about what information is on the FAFSA, it's sort of similar to what would be on a tax form, in that on a tax form, you would be using an ITIN as opposed to a social, and that might be the indicator of citizenship status, although it might not be. There are other reasons why you might use an ITIN. So these are the students that we're really thinking about. I have this final point here on both contributors being undocumented, and I want to clarify what I mean here. Ignacia and I had some back and forth on whether to include this to begin with. It's not necessarily because we're concerned about more information. It's because if parents are married and file taxes together and that they are in a mixed status couple where one member of the couple is undocumented and the other is not, the student could list just their citizen parent as their contributor because they file taxes jointly. So that gets a little bit technical, but this is kind of the group that we're thinking about here when we're considering questions about data security. And I am now going to pass it to Ignacia to talk a little bit more about how information from the FAFSA is stored and shared at the federal level.
Thank you, Corinne. Next slide, please. Personal identifying information is stored in databases and Outlook servers managed by the Department of Education. And so an individual who's an employee of the Department of Ed must pass a security clearance in order to access information that was collected through the FAFSA. And then as far as like interagency sharing of information, there has to be an explicit agreement in place where information is shared across the federal agency. So that would include sharing information between the Department of Ed and the Department of Homeland Security. And currently, we know that there are agreements with the Department of Homeland Security and Ed that outline that data should only be shared to determine students' eligibility for aid. So it's usually to check the immigration status, the eligibility of that student to actually apply and get FAFSA. However, these agreements, we just unfortunately cannot predict what sharing agreements may be in place or may be negotiated under the new administration. And also because of this interagency relationship, we may not be notified as members of the public when there is a change, when there is a new agreement. Next slide, please. There are legal protections apart from those agreements for FAFSA information. So what are the laws that protect FAFSA information? There's the Privacy Act of 1974, which says that federal agencies, amongst other things, are required to collect only information that is relevant and necessary to carry out agency function. They have to ensure the records are used only for the reasons given. So if it's to determine eligibility for FAFSA and financial aid, that's the only reason, or seek the person's permission when another purpose for the record is being used or considered. Provide adequate safeguards to protect the records from unauthorized access and disclosure. The Privacy Act also clarifies that personal identifying information cannot be disclosed without written consent. But it's important to keep in mind that a lot of these privacy protections come with limitations and exceptions. And so there's about 12 for the Privacy Act, 2 of which are most relevant to the FAFSA, which is 1, routine uses. So this allows agencies to share information for a designated set of purposes. These purposes, though, unlike with the agreements that we talked about just a moment ago, they do have to be publicly notified. Any changes would have to go through a process, usually through the Federal Register. And then law enforcement requests. So this allows agencies to request information for civil or criminal law enforcement purposes. But these requests must be made in writing by either the agency head or officials at or above the section chief level. So those are 2 pretty broad exceptions that we have to look out for, but generally the Privacy Act is supposed to protect the information in the FAFSA. FAFSA information is also protected by FERPA, Federal Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974. I won't go into it too much because there are people here on this call who are probably more experts than I am on the topic of FERPA, but I am going to provide in the chat a really useful one-pager that was created on FERPA, keeping in mind the specific population. Now, if information is shared, the reality is we may or may not know. Some changes to existing laws and policies would require, as I mentioned, notice to the public, going through the Federal Register, alerting us of these changes, but that presumes that the incoming administration is going to actually follow the procedures that they're supposed to. Other changes, unfortunately, we may not know, but we may over time identify patterns hinting that something has changed. At that point, legal recourse may be an option. Other ways of finding out if changes could happen could be, for example, members of Congress can host a oversight hearing, asking these questions from Ed, asking for accountability, asking if policies around data protection and collection have changed. There could be a FOIA request, which is a request that anyone actually can make to the federal government. This one would be specifically to the Department of Education, asking what the current data protections that are in place are. But we really don't know. And so that's why it's important to really foster communication with your students and to work with CAAN and with other partners to be able to identify patterns as you begin to see them and to alert us so we can all further investigate and see if some changes or some protocols have been changed. Next slide, please. So this is a little PSA, just because when we're thinking about the information that the government collects, we should also be thinking about the information that we collect. So we currently have a protected areas memorandum in place. So this identifies certain areas as free from immigration law enforcement, which currently includes schools. You may have heard of it. Previously, it was sensitive locations. Now it's called protected areas. But the Trump administration has already said that he plans to end protected areas and to rescind that memorandum. But even without schools being declared and classified as a protected area, there are still things you can do to protect students and their families. So the best practice is to not collect and not store information on citizenship or immigration status. But if you must, consider the questions that are on this slide, right? For what purpose are you collecting the information? Do you need to collect this information? How long do you have to keep the information, right? If it's just to determine eligibility for something at that point in time, do you need to keep an actual record, physical record copy of that document? Consider who has access to the information. If someone outside comes in and asks for this information, what's the protocol in place? Can it possibly go to the superintendent, for example, to evaluate the request before just providing the information forthright? And then also familiarize yourselves with the federal and state laws that are in place, providing privacy protections, some of which we listed today, but again, noting their exceptions and limitations. And then consider additional protocols. For example, if law enforcement does show up to your school, immigration law enforcement, and they ask to speak to a specific student, they've identified, is there a protocol to check the warrant to make sure it's legitimate before bringing the student to that officer? Another example too is if you have a friendly attorney general in your state, they may want to issue guidance to further protect individuals and to further alert the districts, the city of what the protections are in place for these families. Next slide. So Kim at the top provided really great guidance on how you can speak to students and their families at this very critical time. But some additional points that we want to reiterate and build off of now are to, one, reassure students about their eligibility for financial aid. The student is the holder of the benefit, not the contributor. And so the citizenship status of their parents or contributors shouldn't affect their eligibility for financial aid. Make clear that completing the FAFSA is required to access federal financial aid. Second, listen and address their safety and security concerns. Some students may understandably feel nervous about submitting their FAFSA because they are concerned of the safety of their personal information or that of their family members. So just be on the lookout for things like sometimes like dodging questions. My go-to when I was undocumented in school was I can't go to college as code for something being wrong with my immigration status, making me feel like I couldn't. So just be aware that students may be a little hesitant to come forthright and share what's going on. But just, understand that their feelings are valid. They want to protect their family members. They've worked really hard to get to this point. And so we want to be supportive and listen and be a sounding board. And then also stay up to date on the latest developments with FAFSA, just to be able to relay that to our students. 3, respect privacy and avoid directly asking about immigration status. Understandably, some people don't want to talk about this topic and may not want to share about the financial and immigration status of their family members. So if that's the case, you may want to present information to the classroom or to your students, to the students that you're counseling. And then those who are affected can then access that information and then know that you're supportive and that you're informed to be able to turn to you moving forward. Offer alternatives for students who are concerned. So there are alternative ways of being able to finance your education, but of course it's not exactly as strong as what the FAFSA and federal assistance would provide sometimes. But you can consider those options with your students. So that includes considering state financial aid if available, private loans and scholarships, starting a community college before transitioning to a four-year university, applying for unsubsidized loans only, and Corinne in a moment will share some other alternative ideas. And then lastly, emphasize student and family-led decision-making. This is an understandably scary time for mixed status families with reports of mass deportation and not knowing what's going to happen next year. But really the only thing these students can control is their education. And they've worked so hard to get here that it's important for them to feel empowered to continue exploring their options to actually achieve higher education. So we suggest avoiding telling students, do apply for the FAFSA, don't apply for the FAFSA, without really taking the time to talk them through the process, the pros and cons, and then be able to continue to nourish that feeling of empowerment. I know I shared a lot of information, but honestly, just being there for students is enough. And now you have us as resources moving forward. So lastly, I'll leave you with this resource that's linked at the bottom of the slide from so-called CAAN, First Gen Empower, Immigrants Rising, and the Campaign for College Opportunity, which really provides great guidance for supporting undocumented and mixed status families. And so I'll turn it back to you, Corinne.
Hey guys, if I could just jump in right at this moment, I just want to was hoping we could just take on the question, getting a lot of questions about ITINs. And Corinne's been answering some of them in the chat, but there's a broader question that just occurred to me. We know that many of our parents already have ITINs, so they're already part of the government system, and they're already active participants. I'm curious, so just to talk about families who have ITINs and to inform us about that, but then I'm thinking, wow, tax information must be doubly, triply protected, even more so than FERPA or FAFSA information. So how safe are families who have ITINs? I know this is sort of like a coming out of nowhere question, but is that information safe from Trump? So I don't know, just whatever you can say about ITINs would be amazing, because we all have so many students that have them, their families.
I can start and then I'll pass it back to Ignacia. I will give the caveat that I know a lot more about FAFSA than I do about taxes. So although they are very connected, but I'm not as familiar just on the legal protections for tax information. So if Ignacia has something to share, I'll definitely leave that. I think that the main point that we want to make here is that there are protections in place for the use of information that's being held at the federal level, but we can't make guarantees about what's going to be attempted in the next administration. So it's difficult to say, you know, this is what they are going to try to do with this information. And these are, we can prepare for kind of legal responses and challenges to any attempts. But we do think it's important to recognize that the FAFSA is not necessarily the first or only place where families' information is being disclosed to a government agency. And so I want to try to remove some of this weighty sense of responsibility for students, that they are the ones making the decision for the first time about whether to disclose their family's information. That is a big thing to put on a student's shoulders and may not necessarily be accurate to the reality of the family. So this is also not the first time that students and families are encountering a concern about whether to disclose their information for a potential benefit. For example, a lot of families are told that if you pay your taxes over time, then that can help your immigration case in the future. But it is a scary decision to make. Ignacia, I'll turn it back to you to see if you have something to add on the specifics of tax information.
Yeah, so we have colleagues that are more in the weeds of tax information collected, but my initial thought is that it's different when you say that, well, there's less of a risk if you apply for something with one agency because the other federal agency already has your information. Because quite frankly, like, what if they're only looking at the data collected by the Department of Ed or by the FAFSA, right? I think it's just the level of comfortability of the individual and their family members to provide that information is different because they're like, well, you know, I've already gone through this other process with the federal government, such as, you know, getting an I-10 or getting like some kind of benefit from immigration and citizenship services. So I think it's just the comfortability of like, oh, I've already submitted information to them. I'm already somehow on the radar. But I think, you know, it's hard to say because they may not even look at information from the I-10. They may only look at the information provided to the Department of Ed. So we can't unfortunately like say as NILC that there's a minimized risk in that scenario. But it's just the comfortability of the individual varies if they've already had some kind of interaction, some kind of conversation previously on whether or not to submit their information to the federal government. It is important to note though that like not everyone can access an I-10 as easily as they did years ago. So I understand you have parents and other contributors who have, but it's actually increasingly harder to get one. So just something to note.
Thanks for elevating the question, Kim. It gave us an opportunity to answer more robustly than I was able to do in the chat.
And we'll take on some of the remaining questions at the end. I'll let Corinne keep on with her presentation.
Great. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So I know that Ignacia mentioned the importance of offering options when you are supporting students. So what are some of those options? We've been getting a lot of questions about the paper FAFSA and whether the paper FAFSA is a more secure option. So all of the policies that we talked about today that protect the online FAFSA are the same for the paper FAFSA. So it is neither riskier nor safer to do the paper FAFSA in terms of the management of the data. What are the differences? Really what it comes down to is that, as many of you probably know from having done the online FAFSA with mixed status families last year, there is a box that families would check for contributors to say, I do not have a social security number. You would not be checking that box on the paper FAFSA. You would still have an SSN field that you're leaving blank. And I also want to emphasize, many of you probably know this, but I say it in every FAFSA talk I give, do not put an I-10 in a field that specifically asks for an SSN. They are not the same thing. It will cause problems down the line with the student's FAFSA. So make sure that you're just leaving that blank if the contributor does not have a social. So the contributors still need to provide that personally identifiable information, but they're not checking that box that says, I do not have a social. You know, that's the kind of main difference when it comes to the paper FAFSA. Something else to note is what is the residential information that the FAFSA asks for? The FAFSA asks for a permanent mailing address. This needs to be a place where a family can receive mail reliably, even once the student is in college. So theoretically, a family could use a PO box or a different address if they didn't want to use their residential address on the FAFSA. So if you're talking to students who say, I don't know, like I can give my parents' name, but I don't feel comfortable putting in our address, they could establish a PO box or use an alternative mailing address, as long as it is a place where they can receive mail over the following year. The last question is this question of state aid. I do want to note that the FAFSA is the only way for students to access federal aid. So if they don't fill out the FAFSA, they will be foregoing their Pell Grants, which is a hefty sum of money. So this is not a replacement for the Pell Grant. And it would also mean that they're not eligible for the myriad other forms of aid that the FAFSA facilitates, including certain types of loans, federal work study, things like that. We do know that there are some states that are opening up the option for students to fill out something like a DREAM Act application that ordinarily would have been only open to undocumented students applying for state aid. I believe as of yesterday that New York State had not made an official decision on whether they were going to give this option. So that's sort of a TBD for all of you in New York. But it is an option that we're seeing in other states, again, with the caveat that that is not the same as getting access to federal aid, including the Pell Grant. But it might become an option in New York State. I don't have any inside or background information on how likely that is to become an option, but it's something that's being explored in different states around the US. So those are just a couple of the options here. As Ignacia mentioned, students might come in with some different ideas. Some of them might decide that they want to go to community college to see how the first couple of years go before transitioning to a bachelor's degree granting institution. There are alternative scholarships and loans available, but these will not be the same as getting access to Pell. So I just want to make sure that we're really clear about what it means to not fill out the FAFSA and what the consequences of that would be. We are continuing to pull together some of these options. And I'm seeing some folks in the chat who might be more familiar with TAP. So this is referring to the DREAM Act. So the DREAM Act is currently open to students who are not FAFSA eligible. I'm not sure if they've opened it up to students who are FAFSA eligible, but decide not to apply for it. So that's the distinction. I know that there is a way for students who are not FAFSA eligible to apply for TAP. But I'm not sure if they've made that open to other students. They might, but I just don't know. That is happening in some other states. Let's see. So these are a couple of things. I know we're giving a lot of information. If we could go to the next slide, please, Sandy. So you don't have to remember all of this today. We have a lot of resources coming out. Everything that we've talked about in terms of how data is stored and who has access to it is available in this data explainer on the higher ed immigration portal. We'll be sharing all of this in our follow-up materials. And next slide, please. And even more resources are available on the FAFSA hub for mixed status families, also hosted on the higher ed immigration portal. I will give a disclaimer that I am the one and only person who manages this hub. So sometimes it doesn't get updated as quickly as I would like, as I'm trying to keep the general resources up to date while responding to individual inquiries. But if you notice that something is outdated, please send me an email, which I will drop in the chat. I am doing my best to keep it up to date, but sometimes I miss an errant FAQ or something like that that is outdated from the prior year. I believe I've answered most of the questions in the chat right now. So this question on having information attached to a PO box, I don't know the specifics here of kind of, again, how protected information would be. I think we need to be kind of grounded in what we know at this moment. There will be a lot of questions and a lot of speculation. When we're working with students, I think that the main responsibility here, as we've discussed before, is to try to provide them with accurate and up-to-date information about what we do know without necessarily speculating on all of the different possibilities. I think one of the main messages that's coming out of this attention to FAFSA is that there is a lot of fear, there's a lot of rhetoric, there is a lot of stuff that we are going to keep track of and try to keep updated. And at the end of the day, we can't predict every scenario, but what we can do is try to empower students with information to make choices about their post-secondary pathways. And then also to be ready to defend students' right to financial aid. And that is the other piece, kind of separate from this counseling conversation, that we will be focused on at our organizations as well, is keeping tabs on what is changing and how we can continue to assure that students are able to access the aid that they're entitled to. Kim or Sandy, are there other questions that you want to elevate at this stage?
Well, since we have a lawyer on the phone,
Not giving legal advice, I will say.
no, but this is what you both are plugged into, sort of what folks are thinking about in terms of legal challenges and trying to protect the minute, jump on protecting families the minute Trump tries to do anything that's unkosher. Do you have a sense of like if they try to dive into any of these databases, whether it be the FAFSA database, whether it be the ITI, the tax or treasury database, like who's monitoring that and what the immediate legal challenges would be to that? I mean, that's breaking so many laws. And it's really important to understand that they can't, that it's important that everybody understand that there would be immediate legal challenges to that. So just, can you give a sense of just what that would involve if they try to break into a bunch of these databases that are really sacred?
Yeah, unfortunately, the National Immigration Law Center can't provide any guarantees that legal action would be warranted without knowing the specifics of what they're doing, and how they're doing it. And the also important point to make is that we may not be aware immediately that they're doing something. It may happen over time. So yeah, so unfortunately, I can't promise that there would be legal recourse, but chances are there would be litigation filed if something like that were to happen, to then extract more information to get into the specifics, at least, of what's going on. These actions tend to be a lot more covert. They don't tend to be, for example, following like a press statement saying we are now, accessing databases from the Treasury or from Ed to identify people for immigration law enforcement purposes. So who's monitoring? We all are. We all have to be vigilant and be able to see, okay, is there a pattern here? Are parents being identified? Are contributors being identified? And are they people that have submitted their information to FAFSA? They may have been people already on the federal government's radar. Maybe they had an administratively closed, meaning they were before an immigration judge at one point, and then they closed their case, and now it's being reopened. So they may have been identified in other ways. But it's just important for us to stay vigilant, because the tendency thus far, even under friendlier administrations, has been for the Department of Homeland Security to be able to point to what's normally referred to as like independent sources of gathering that the person is possibly undocumented. And so we just have to stay vigilant to then be like, well, you're citing to this, but really you're extracting information from these databases that are protected. So sorry, apologies. I wish I could provide more guarantees, but the ACLUs of the world, organizations like ours would definitely be quick to look into litigation as a possibility, but we can't promise any successes or any like claims that we would definitely be able to bring forward without knowing specifics.
And I just put some resources in the chat. The second one that I posted here is something that we just put up earlier this week, called the Rights and Responsibilities Hub. But this includes information about immigration databases, information sharing systems, and things like that, not just specific to FAFSA. So that is the place where we will be putting information and resources pertaining to this question more broadly. I also wanted to highlight, I know we've really focused on FAFSA, which is the topic at hand today, but many of you may also be working with students who are not FAFSA eligible. So that's just something else to be attuned to, especially under kind of the current era of universal FAFSA completion, and ways to be sensitive to working with students who cannot fill out the FAFSA. And we have a ton of resources at the President's Alliance on that topic as well, which I'm not going to go into today again because we're here to talk about FAFSA, but we are here to support that too.
And I know there was a question about what New York State offers at the current moment for students, and we were talking about the DREAM Act, which is for students who are undocumented. I think there is discussion, and I know California has this in place, right? That of possibly offering DREAM Act doorway to families that are to possibly families in mixed status. It does not exist right now. But that might be something that it will happen in the future. And I also know that Governor Hochul has been having talks about ways to provide further protections for New York State residents and New York State students. And that is a big part of this, is the local context. We are New York State. We are New York City. We have more protections than maybe other parts of the United States do. And so we have to sort of stay on top of what's happening in terms of our own state protections. And we also we have really friendly schools, SUNY and CUNY. So well, once again, these are all real positive things to keep in mind, is that we are a sanctuary state and a sanctuary city and sanctuary schools. What can we do to make sure that our students and families feel safe in this time and know that we're on their side?
All right. Thank you so much, Kim, for summing it up. Corinne, Ignacia, thank you. I am giving you a loud clap. Right. Chano and I are gonna take over here. What we want to do is do some, no, that's not what I'm trying to do. This is what I'm trying to do. Not it keep clicking me. Hold on. Okay. So we're gonna do some small group stuff. So let me turn it to Chano to give us some instructions. I'm also gonna put in the chat the questions that are on this screen.
Yeah. Friends, all of you, we want to give you a moment to sort of process all this good information together. Think about the implications that has on your work. So you can see on the screen here, right, there's some prompt questions we're going to give you, and we're going to put you in small groups together. We're going to give you a little bit of time, about 15 minutes or so, to discuss this. So get in there, try to tackle all the questions, a few of the questions, maybe one, if that's what you gravitate towards. But here's a couple of things that are really important. As we switch you into the groups, we're going to drop a couple links. One thing to be aware of is, what is your group number? Because we're going to have a document with different group number links. So for instance, if you are group 5, you want to put your notes in the group 5 link on that document. It's going to be broken up by different group numbers. And also designate a note taker, because we'd love to see some notes from y'all. So whatever you talk about, designate somebody to take down those notes in the appropriate place. And designate a reporter, because we are going to take a minute to hear at least from a handful of people who want to share out. So who's going to take notes? Who's going to report on those notes? Be aware of the group number that you're in so that you're putting your notes in the right place. We're going to give you 2 links to give you all that good information. Sandy, anything else you want to add to that?
No, that's it. I'm gonna put it in the chat, the questions, and the link. And also, I see a lot of people leaving. It's cool, you gotta go. At the same time, this is the place where we're gonna digest the information that was just shared with us, and where we're gonna really develop our best practice for moving forward. So if you can stay, we'd love that. We'd really
don't digest alone.
Yeah. All right. So I'm gonna open the rooms, and you should see that on your screen.
Sandy, I'm gonna pause the recording while folks are in breakout groups.
That's great, Chano. Thank you so much.
In the chat that we didn't really take on. So like, so we could still do a little bit of that too, in addition to sort of hearing from folks about what happened in the rooms. So.
Yeah, definitely want to prioritize hearing back from the group. But then if we can, I love that idea, Kim. And if not, I'm definitely, and I know you are doing this too, Kim, downloading the chat That's our practice. We always like to keep the chat, and maybe we could pull out any unanswered questions and circulate them in within our smaller planning group. And then hopefully we can share them back out with folks. I hope that's cool, right? All right, Chano, you want to get us started chatting about the small groups?
Yeah, welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed the groups. Hope they were productive for you. And
Oh, we have to mute.
okay, is this the AI going on? All right. I'm gonna keep going here. I might be a little bit of echo with everybody on.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, you're good.
So yeah, for groups, if you want to, we're going to ask some people to share out, have that designated reporter share a little bit. And, for the purposes of keeping time, I think try to keep it brief, really start out something where maybe you all had a lot of consensus, maybe you had some discord, maybe there are big question marks around a topic and, get into that and tell us about it. Does anybody want to jump in first?
I can go. I was in group 13.
Awesome.
I'll link our notes in the chat just because I had a lovely discussion with Amber Peters. Didn't expect to laugh in this space, and yet we did. And we just discussed that right now it feels like we're going over and operating on a lot of hypotheticals, and so we don't really know what will happen. It's a lot of, the next administration proposing these things and saying these things and distracting us, it feels like, but it's also important to make sure the students are prepared and make sure that those who have concerns and questions have those concerns and questions addressed. And something that Amber noticed about the students that she worked with, that some of them are just acting as normal. They aren't as concerned, or they aren't showing their concern with what is going on next year or what will happen next year. So it was an interesting observation of, we have all of these concerns and we understand what could happen, but the students may not have those concerns or feel comfortable sharing those concerns with us.
Thank you so much. I think that's how a lot of us feel with this presentation, right? Some of the distraction and what to anticipate is kind of seems intentional even, right? To kind of throw us off. And so we have to deal in this atmosphere and we can't assume how students are feeling, right? We've got to kind of just follow their vibe and what are they asking and try to encourage them to speak freely in a safe space. So I think a lot of us can relate to that. I really appreciate that. Norma.
Hi. So we were in group 2, and so we were really kind of we were digesting out loud what we heard, and how we were feeling about what we heard. And one of the places that I think there was some consensus is that we're counselors first, right? And so that our goal and our job is never to give students a do this or do that, but rather to listen to them and connect them to the right resources to make an informed decision. So that is like a walk away feeling good with, because it's business as usual there. And ultimately that these are decisions families and students decisions to make with our love, empathy, and support, and that we have each other to lean on. One thing that I shared in the group, and would love, maybe not in this conversation, but future ones, to hear more about what people think about this idea of, like, do we need to ask more questions when our students are sharing around, are either of your parents justice involved, right? Because is that at a higher risk? And so asking more in-depth questions that can help us say, you actually should talk to someone before you make this decision, such as, and here's a colleague. And do we need more partnerships with legal service providers who will have the capacity and the bandwidth? Are these going to be our Queens folks? Are these going to be our Manhattan folks, right? And just this idea of, like, how are we strengthening partnerships so that we're also not sending families shout out to all of my faves, to places that are going to be overwhelmed and not able to provide them the support that they need. So that's where we landed.
I love that. I love that as a next step, right? Like, first off, I love all the calls for community. I love that you said it too. And I love the idea of building some sort of series of questions to ask. And then additionally, the resources that we want to send folks to. That feels like, because that was our next thing we were going to go to, is just like next steps. Because to me, this feels like more than a meeting, but rather like an action group. And there's a ton of calls to action. And I heard you make some right now. So maybe we could follow up with some documents that we could sort of contribute to together with some of these questions and referrals. I'd love that. Sylvia.
Sandy, I have a question because I thought about when you opened for conversation at the beginning and you talked about what kind of supports we were getting from our families. And I'm going to tell you, yes, I am old. For real, I am so old that the year I started college was the year they put in TAP, because remember, CUNY, because my older brothers and sisters went to CUNY when CUNY was free. And maybe that needs to be back on the table. Like,
That would be awesome.
How do we make CUNY free again? Because CUNY, for the most part, for a lot of our students, it is free, whether kids get Pell, whether they're part of ASAP, whether if they are part of the DREAM Act, it'll cover it, Excelsior. So what can that political action be that CUNY becomes free again?
I love that.
And that way you're not cherry picking or spotting kids, because to me, I tell my kids, I said, it's because Norma's my coach, shout out to my great coach, that it's a matter that you get to college. You know, I love the fact that you think that you want to have a residential experience and everything, but we got to be realistic about the line to pay for college starts at your house. And if you don't have that kind of money, it's about you being able to go to school, get a degree if you need a degree to go on with the next part of your life, or even take part of the CUNY workforce, which is free. But if we can get to the point again where CUNY is just free for New York City residents.
So I'm over here wearing my own cap, right? It's just like, make CUNY free again. I love that.
Well, and so yeah, I think I appreciate that the focus on the dream, right, of what we can still try to accomplish, and there are some agencies and coalitions in the city trying to still fight for that right now. So that's an ongoing thing, and maybe we can put back some more resources in here about struggles like those. But I'm hearing the advocacy piece, right? Like so in the middle of this battle, are we always going to be reactionary, or do we sort of charge forward with some new solutions, right, that might better help our students and communities? Sandy, do we have room for one more group to share out?
Let's hear from one more group, please. While we are, if it's okay, I'm gonna put up a poll, just for our own evaluation, like I told you I would. But please continue, Chano.
All right, so let's get one more. Do we have a group reporter? Anybody? Let's see.
I can share.
Thank you.
So one of the things that my group and I were talking about was just thinking about how even if we have these conversations with parents, and even if we give students all this information, how do we know they understand? So I was thinking about my own experience, and when I had to fill out all these forms, my parents didn't know what any of it meant. They're not from the US. They can't really read or speak English. And I could translate as best as I could, and my counselor translated for my parents as best as she could, but at the end of the day, they just don't understand. And how do we talk to parents who might be dealing with the same thing, with students who might be dealing with the same issue in a way that they can actually understand. Because a lot of times when we're working with undocumented parents, they might have not grown up in the US. They might not understand our laws and all of the bureaucracy that surrounds like everything that's happening at this day and age. But yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and Brenda, and I think you shared a little bit earlier in the chat, and I'm kind of curious, like, what was something that really helped you navigate this or help your family understand?
Well, that's the thing. I didn't have that help. I had to figure it out on my own. And I had a really hard time when I first started college in 2017. So I had to figure out how to do the financial aid and the TAP. And my counselor, our school was huge. She couldn't really help. She met with me, I think, once or twice during the school year when this was happening my senior year. So it was a lot of Googling for me. And then even now, I have all my younger siblings are going to college or have started college, and I'm the one doing their FAFSA and their TAP and their financial aid because my parents just don't understand.
So it was a lot of like what you didn't have and what you wish you would have had. I'm hearing too.
Yeah,
right?
that's basically my job now, which but yeah.
I really appreciate that, and I sort of I want to throw this back to everybody, and maybe there's a couple suggestions in the audience, in the chat, because are we straight up just getting language translation? What are some other helpful resources to really help our students and their families understand this information? And that might kind of segue us into some of what we want to do in closing. So I think if there's any suggestions, how are you helping families understand this information we're getting or the current situation?
Hi, in our group, we talked maybe more private conversations so we can speak to families, because that was my concern. I always think of that mental script, and I'm not going to just throw a blanket statement, and being that I have to monitor the updates, but maybe more individual conversations with families, what they're comfortable with, and just being as transparent as possible. Yeah, that's what we kind of hashed out. But we had a lot of open-ended questions, like, what does this mean? What do we say? How do we do, yeah, but thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that.
Another idea that we talked about in group 21, was to build like worksheets. So take things out of conversation, and like as we're referencing like resource flyers or pages or fact sheets, like pulling out the most salient points that stick for a person and putting them onto paper so that we can continue to reference them, to like write down the questions together so we can continue to reference them and like fill in answers or fill in resources. So really just like taking things out of conversations that evaporate and putting them onto centralized papers that we can talk to families about and translate and re-reference.
Thank you. That's a great suggestion. And all these little tools we can share out when we have successes, and like folks said, it's about community. I'm hearing the collaboration of CBOs and schools is going to be super important. Sandy, should we move to close here? And
You're on mute, my love.
I know that what you're gonna say.
Yeah.
So as we move to close, if you haven't, please do answer my poll. You may have closed it out. Thanks a lot. It's okay. Do your best. Yeah, so thank you so much for attending. As we close out the meeting, think real quick. We've already mentioned so many next steps. I'm really excited. I'm definitely gonna rewatch this and like is getting my wheels going. I may send out as part of the resources like some just like sheets that we could crowdsource together. I think that would be really cool. Like work on things to work on together. I think that's gonna be the start of this well, this is the start of this community. That's gonna be the continuation. Think about your next steps and make sure you take them with you. Write them down because we're about to go on to a break and we don't want to forget it. I don't think your passion's going to let you forget all of this, but just in case, please write down a next step. And if you'd like to share, please throw it in the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. there's definitely 100% gonna be follow-up from us on this. Resources, like I said, crowdsource opportunities. Who knows, like if we want this, like let's meet again, whatever it is. This is important. This is gonna be something we gotta keep our finger on the pulse of. I don't know, Chano, Kim, anything else to add?
Well, I definitely want to come back to this conversation. So I think as we're sharing back resources after the break and we're synthesizing, we would want to hear from all of you too. And we'll put out that invite is, should we have big forums like this? What other type of speakers should we have? But maybe you want to do it in more specific communities. Do we look to break up small gatherings and opportunities to share and get better at this? So we'll just, let us know what you need.
And I just want to thank and flag all the resources that Corinne and Ignacia's group offer. There's a couple of, first of all, President's Alliance does the best webinars in America on all kinds of interesting issues focused on immigration and students. So you should get their emails and just follow and watch everything that they put out. They're phenomenal. And then the hub, which they put together, has so much information. And so you'll be getting all of these resources in the follow-up email, but I can't say enough good about both of their organizations and all the fantastic work they're doing. And this is something that we are going to have to watch day in and day out. And that also means watching the press and just keeping your eye on what's happening. But I think it's really the advocacy groups in DC that are going to probably have the first sense of what's going on. And then when we know, when they know, we should know. And then we can share it out with each other. And we'll be coming up with our own New York State solutions in partnership with the governor, CUNY, SUNY, those kinds of things. And we'll keep you informed. And obviously, visit understandingfafsa.org. I'll be putting out. Gotta put in my plug.
I love it. Plugging.
Guidance available in English on the site and translations coming soon.
Yep. And all the FAFSA guides in 10 languages. So
that's right. That's right. Thank you so much, everyone. Season's greetings. Have a great break. You will be hearing from us. And keep up the great work for sure. For sure.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.